Hello.
Good morning.
Okay, so can we start now? Hello. Can anybody
I'm
hear
coming.
me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Let me
Okay.
check the number of people in attendance. I think we can start now.
Okay, all right. So good morning, everyone, and hope we're keeping safe. All right,
Yeah,
so
good
thanks for
morning.
joining us today for the session. I'm Babajide Ojo, and a cloud infrastructure engineer at Signal Alliance. Today, our discussion would focus on disaster recovery and business continuity. So, at the moment, we all know that the country is on lockdown and most companies have to work remotely and run their services outside their on-prem environment. So this session is just a brief overview of what steps we can put in place in terms of how we can ensure resiliency for our system and our application, because for most organizations now that are currently running most of the application on prem, it means that they need to have someone currently in the office and ensure that there is uptime for all the applications. So disaster recovery is just a way by which we can put in place resiliency for those systems. So I'm going to start with basically what disaster recovery is. And it's currently on the screen, says these are steps we take to reestablish availability of application after an outage has occurred. So for instance, you have your application running on-prem and during this lockdown, one of your scripts that probably needs to run before your application kicks off online stops running, and you don't have means of getting yourself to the office to ensure that your application is live. It means for the period of time that the lockdown is going to be on, your application is definitely going to be down and your customers cannot access your application. Your customers cannot access your solutions that you've provided for them. So disaster recovery is a way by which you can mitigate against that to ensure that even when there's a failover on your on-prem application, you can always have a replica of that particular application or server on Azure. Now, we go to the challenges that business faces when it comes to disaster recovery. Everybody knows that when you're talking about disaster recovery, it's just more or less like insurance that we all have on our different properties. So, first of all, the roadblocks for businesses. One, complexity of protecting data and application. So for some applications that are very complex, it takes a whole lot of technicalities to be able to effectively put in place a disaster recovery mechanism. So sometimes it could be very difficult. But what we're saying is if we are able to come analyze your environments, we can put in place a proper disaster recovery mechanism that would ensure that your application do not stay downtime even when you have failovers. Another challenge is businesses face is too much data, often with insufficient protection. So for instance, you're trying to put in a disaster recovery mechanism in place and you're trying to back up your database, and the last backup you have is probably from 3 days old. Maybe your application interacts with your customers like on a daily, maybe they fill in a form of like let's say 500 every day. That is the kind of traffic you're getting on your application is like 500, and your last backup is probably like 2 days or 3 days away. It means when you have disaster, you cannot recover immediately to have sufficient data that would be enough to kick back to live production. There's a long data retention requirement. This is also a big challenge because I'll give this one, for instance. We know banks, they probably have CCTV cameras, and those CCTV cameras are capturing images and videos and all. Each of those captures that are being made needs to be stored in a particular place for a period of time before they could shelve it off and take it away in case someone wants to report a fraud alert, for instance. Now, so they need to go to the archive and go check the dates. When you provide them with the dates and all of those information, they need to go check into their archives to be able to pull out the recordings from that particular incident now captured from the CCTV camera. But we know that if all those data needs to be stored probably on their on-premise infrastructure, because the recording takes place every day, every minute, your data infrastructure is definitely going to fill up in no time. So what we're saying is we could set up a disaster recovery plan for you to continually move some of these data onto Azure, and from Azure there are different replication procedures that can be put in place. So for instance, now if you know that okay, some of these recordings are over a year or 2 years, now you could set them up from just I'd say from accessibility, then we'll put them into archive mode. So the difference between storage cost reduces, but your pooling cost now is a bit much, rather than when you put it on an availability that you are accessing the data every time. So we could put in place that kind of replication whereby, okay, so for after a month, you could replicate those your recordings onto an Azure blob storage, and you just archive them over time. So you don't need to overstretch your on-prem infrastructure. Another challenge that business have with disaster recovery in putting in place is also time-intensive media management. Okay, so some of them, you know how critical time is for your application. If some banks now, if your application goes down for 3-4 minutes, they know how much money they are losing within that time. So you need to put in place a proper disaster recovery mechanism. Another challenge is untested disaster recovery and decreasing recovery confidence. So yeah, this one is pretty tricky because when you put in place a disaster recovery mechanism and you've never done a test failover, you've never done a failover at any point, you don't know how far or how well that disaster recovery put in place is going to work. So you can only assume that, oh, we've backed up this data and we hope that it is going to be replicated in the time that we need it. In case of any failover, we're able to recover our data. But if you don't have a proper automated process that can ensure to test failover, then you cannot be so sure that whatever you've put in place for redundancy will be able to work. Now, which is the biggest challenge for businesses most times, is always cost. Because to put in place disaster recovery means you're putting up a redundancy somewhere. There is no guarantee that at this time you're going to need it, but yet you need to put in place that particular infrastructure. So what do we do generally is to help businesses, to help them sit down and discuss with them. Okay, so what are the critical impact applications that you have? What are the critical servers that when they go down, it's going to drastically affect your business? So those are those servers or applications that we want to help set up disaster recovery for, so that you just don't set up a redundancy for every of your application or every of your servers. So at this way, we could help them manage their cost and also set up a proper disaster recovery plan for them. Now, when you talk about disaster recovery, there are some key I'll call them objectives that needs to be put in place. So first one is the RTO and the second one is the RPO. So the RTO is the recovery time objective. That is the duration at which the process must be restored to avoid unacceptable consequences. So for instance, now you don't want a bank app to be down for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and they are still saying, oh, developers, they are trying to fix this, they're trying to fix that. You need to ensure that your applications are properly mapped in such a way that you have a grace period by which, okay, you can still accept when you have downtime and you're trying to fail over onto your disaster recovery mode, or you have to ensure that you set up a particular critical time that you know that your application should not go down beyond that time, or else the data you're going to be getting after that will be difficult to replicate your application back to life at a proper interval. The RPO is also the recovery point objective. That is how far back can you go for you to ensure that you have proper data. So for instance, you have a database that continually gets requests about every five minutes. The data continually changing, and something hits your server, or probably an hacker hacks your server and everything goes down. You need to ensure that at what point would you be able to recover back that when you spin up your application back to life, the data still remains acceptable. So for instance, if your last backup is probably weeks ago, it means that you're probably in a very, very precarious situation where your data are probably not valid enough to be able to get back on life. Are we there? Hello?
Yes.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're there.
Yes, we
Okay.
can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. So those are some of those key objectives that you want to discuss with the stakeholder. So the customer needs to come up and tell us, okay, so for this critical application, this is the time limit that we can have before we know that any other data that is coming after this is not valid enough, is not acceptable enough. So those are those objectives that you sit down with the stakeholders. When we agree, then we set up a disaster recovery mechanism to work around that timeline to ensure that those time limits are not exceeded for any backup plan to spin up, and to ensure that the services and application comes back to life right on time. So the next thing is we talk about disaster recovery plan. When you want to plan a disaster recovery, you want to set up a plan and ensure, okay, so how are we going to create a disaster recovery for customer A? Customer A already tells us, okay, these are this critical application and these are the timeline. So we want to first of all evaluate the business impact application. So for every businesses, not all servers are business impact. Some server can go down and even the end user might not know. So they might just be internal applications that are probably managing some monitoring services. Yes. So firstly, we want to evaluate the business impact application and ensure that how are we going to set up disaster recovery for that one. The second one is we want to automate the recovery process as much as possible. This cannot be overemphasized. Automate. The reason for automation is because when you automate a process, it can be repeated without error. But when your disaster recovery plan is too manual, that is everything, you have to probably start from A to B to C to D for your application to get back on life after a disaster has occurred, then you know that in the case of pressure, your server is down, your application is down, your managers are shouting, everybody is just on your head. There's definitely going to be errors when you're trying to recover back. So you want to automate the process as much as possible. Another thing you want to do is, for those processes that cannot be automated, you want to document those manual steps so everybody has it. So it's not that it's only one person or two person in the organization that understands, okay, when we fully recovered, when we fully migrated into our plan B infrastructure that we fail over onto, what needs to be done. So maybe you have a script that needs to be run before your applications come back to life. Even though you have all your data sitting in your new failover point, you still need to run maybe an underlying script that probably run a daemon process to ensure that, okay, everything now spins up back to life and the application is live. But if those processes are not documented, then it becomes a problem. Now, for this one, this other point, cross-region recovery architecture, this one should always be done. Most especially is applicable to solutions that are running in Azure. So you want to set up a cross-region recovery for your application. For instance, now you have a web application that is running in, let's say, US East 1, and you want to set up a disaster recovery or resiliency plan for that application, so that even when that particular application goes down for whatever reason, you still want your end user to be able to access your application, to access your information. Then you don't want to set up that same application in that same region. So you have an application, web application running in US East 1. You want to set up another replica of that application in maybe central US, and you have an Azure front door that maps traffic from one end to another. The last point here is perform regular disaster simulation to validate and improve your plan. So for this one now, this can only be done if you probably have your disaster recovery plan in a place like Azure. Because if you want to say you want to perform regular disaster simulation, maybe every 6 months, you want to ensure that, okay, what if we shut down this our on-prem environment, our on-prem server? Can the one in Azure, can it spin up immediately? What is the time lag between the on-prem environments going down and the time for the one on Azure to spin up immediately? You want to always run simulations to ensure and improve that particular plan. Any questions so far? Okay, so
hello. My name is. Can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you.
My name is Toju Ayushede.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting me to this workshop.
Okay.
I missed a couple of minutes because I was trying to set up, and that's what I'm saying. So I missed the first slide actually, and I was wondering if before we go too far, you could just give us a short, for those of us who joined late, again, apologies for that. Just a short recap of how you, because I'm really interested in this and I want to see the build up towards this other slides. I have a few other questions, but I think it's maybe you might have, answered them or gone through them in one of the early slides. So that's what I'm looking for, if that's possible.
Sorry, can you? I seem to lose you at a point. You were saying
Oh,
that
you lost me.
Yeah, the previous.
I think. Can you please recap? I think, like I said, I joined late, and if you were able to recap the first slide, I think you've gone through before we start. I joined. I think one or two slides. You've gone through one or two slides, and I was wondering if you could just recap the first two slides with us, so that those of us who joined late can also benefit from.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
I'm sorry about it because I have questions. If I ask those questions, it's possible that you already answered them in the first slide. So.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. So the few slides I've gone over before are talking about what disaster recovery is in itself. Also, the challenges business continuity would have in setting up a disaster recovery plan. So these are just every roadblocks that businesses would have to set up a proper disaster recovery. We know that cost is always a problem. We know that technicality is always the problem. We know that complexity of the infrastructure that they have on-prem is also a challenge for them. So here now we talked about the objectives in terms of what are for them to ensure that even in the case of disaster, the application can come back on life without so much problem. So we talked about the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. So that is the time it's which is going to take for the application to recover back to life production, and the point at which the data must not exceed before the applications come back to life. So I made an example of you having your application down for like 2 weeks, and you know that the way your application is structured, you probably have users eating your application maybe every day. Then you know that if your recovery point is like 2 weeks old, then that is a big problem, because you cannot sync the data from the 2 weeks that is lost and the time you're going to be able to recover onto. I also talked about this disaster recovery plan. You want to evaluate the business impact application. You want to know those applications that you need to ensure that they do not go down. And eventually, if they do go down, you want to bring them back to speed as fast as possible. You want to evaluate those ones out, then set up the disaster recovery plan for that. Then automate every process as much as possible so that in case of failover, the process is always very smooth. I also talked about documenting manual steps that needs to be taken. So even when your process is automated, we know that in case of disaster recovery, not every process from end to end can be automated. So even when you still need to probably get into the server and run a script, you want to ensure that that process is documented. I also talked about cross-region recovery architecture. So for cross-region recovery architecture, I spoke about web applications where you have to ensure that if you're running for resiliency now or for redundancy, if you're running web applications, you want to ensure that you're running them at different regions so that you could fail over to any region when one region is down or probably has an error. And I also talked about regular simulation of your disaster recovery plan. So you want to ensure that even when you set up disaster recovery in place, you want to simulate and do a test failover to be sure that in case of when your application goes down, your failover would always work. So that is all I've done so far. Any other question before I move on?
Yeah. Yes, fantastic. But thank you again for recapping. I wanted to find out because from that last slide when you talked about the DC plan itself,
Yes.
I want to know what are the potential, who are the potential stakeholders in designing or developing a plan, because I can imagine that such a plan will cut across, especially within your entire IT ecosystem within an organization. So, what are some of the, let's say, key, or who are the key stakeholders that one needs to liaise with in actually doing this?
Okay, so you've talked about you want to know who are the key stakeholders that we need to involve when we're setting up a disaster recovery plan, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so yes, so when you're talking about the stakeholders that you need to put to ensure that you set up a proper disaster recovery, number one person is always your application owner. So the person is, you're looking at who exactly is in charge of this application, who takes ownership of this application. The application owner is the one that can determine what is so important to them as regards the application. Aside from your infrastructural engineer and your IT engineers that need to set up those disaster recovery plans, you want to ensure that you're carrying along your application owner and probably your project manager along, so that they are the one that are going to set up the timeline in terms of the recovery time objective and the recovery point objectives for those applications, for your critical applications.
Can I just jump in and add? My name is Emmanuel. I head the cloud and data analytics team for Signal Alliance. I just want to add also that in having that conversation within the organization, you'd also, when you're talking about a disaster recovery, that includes the people as well. So there's an element of HR to it as well, to have people. So assuming your physical site is down and you failed over, but there's nobody to switch on the lights or keep the applications running. So your conversation would expand to having the people, the business owners, the people that are actually going to be there. So there's a HR component to it as well. So really there's representation from every key aspect of the business in putting together the disaster recovery plan, because that feeds into what you might want to term the business continuity strategy for the entire organization.
I totally agree with you, Manu. Thank you for that contribution. Because I was looking at it from a perspective of project management. I'm a project manager and implementation manager. I've done lots of projects. So I know that with disaster recovery and business continuity, these are usually activities that are taken or seen as projects, and that's why
exactly
I purposely asked that question, because when you do such an activity, it must be handled as a project, and as a project, you need to involve your stakeholders. There has to be a pure and clear communication plan, which will obviously involve and needs to be disseminated to all stakeholders. And that's why I was asking, because I believe that this is a knowledge sharing forum for us, and we can learn from each other. So it's clear that it has to be seen as a project. We need to involve the right stakeholders. We need to communicate first, get information from all the other stakeholders, what they need, what they require, what they're expecting, and also communicate back to them in terms of what will be done, when it will be done. The fail over fallback scenarios, and so on and so forth.
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution.
All right. So now we're looking at Azure, which is the point of reference here. So Azure has some backup solutions already in place. So for instance, if you need to spin up your infrastructure on Azure, you could have Azure Backup Agent. So for your on-prem, if you just want to probably recover your files, recover your documents onto Azure, you could set up an Azure Backup Agent. So what that would do is to install an agent on your on-prem physical servers, and you register them to your Azure project on site recovery, and you could always do a failover from your on-prem onto Azure that would back up all those your data from your on-prem onto Azure. You'd also have Azure Backup Server, which in this case, you want to actually back up the infrastructure itself, that is the server and the application running on those servers. You want to recover them and fail them over onto Azure. So for this one now, you probably have your server central management servers, which is either Hyper-V, VMware. It could also be SharePoint or Exchange. So in that one, you set up your Azure Backup solution on the central management server, and it's going to be able to pull information from every other server that is attached to that central management server. For your VMs on Azure, generally when you spin up an Azure VM, when you're running through the processes, it asks you for infrastructure redundancy. In case of infrastructure redundancy, that is when it's going to spin up more servers for you, not just that single server you're trying to spin up, but it's going to spin up more servers for you depending on the geolocation that you've set up, either an availability set, which is going to give you about 99.95 SLA, which is service level agreement that is going to be available, or an availability zone, which is going to give you about 99.99% of availability every time. So what that does is it replicates your application in 3 different regions. So if you're spinning up your server in, let's say, US Central, it's going to be spinning up that same application for you maybe in US East and also US West. And also application backup solution in Azure is the SQL Server solution. So you could also spin up redundancy and availability for your SQL Server. And the last one is application service backup. For this one here, I would run through a demo for us on this app service, whereby I can go to the spin. I had 2 web applications already, and I'm using an Azure front door, which is going to load balance traffic from both applications onto one part. So this is a typical diagram representation of what the application agent is going to look like. So here now you have a Windows Server 2012, and that is where you probably have your files and shares. So you want to have your application agent from Azure. You download the agent onto that particular server and you register it. Immediately you register it and signs up, it's going to be able to sync your data onto Azure directly, which is encrypted. For application backup server, which is also this, here now you want to download the application agent on the central management server, which is either your VMware, the host itself, or you want to download it on the Hyper-V host itself. Then in that case too, from your Azure Site Recovery, when you make all your settings and every process being made clearly, then you could do a test failover too. There, I'm going to show us what the dashboard looks like and one test failover that I did. So for this VM backup, it's just clear on Azure. Immediately you spin up your server, it's always going to ask you if you want a redundancy and if you don't want a redundancy. So the way this one is on Azure is you don't necessarily have to do anything from your end manually. From the start, if you select redundancy, then it's going to replicate your servers and your applications all through the different regions, depending on the SLA that you availability set or an availability zone. So this is a typical web application that you have your application on priority 1. This is one application. The same application is also replicated in another region here. So instead of a traffic manager, I'm going to be using an Azure front. But an Azure front door is a new service in Azure now that does a little bit more than what the application manager is. So your user does not even know which of the application is hitting. It's just getting directly to one particular DNS, and the application front door or traffic manager is going to load balance the traffic to either of the endpoints that are currently available. Any question? So this is just a general overview of you setting up a disaster recovery. Now, for this topic is actually very, very wide and very, very technical. So for have a very, to have an hands-on session is going to take more than 30 minutes for us. So this is just a brief overview, and we're just trying to give an overview of what you could set up on Azure to have your disaster recovery. So any question?
No question.
Okay. So, all right. So I'll just quickly take us to a demo session where I have. Okay, yeah. So typically, when you want to set up your disaster recovery on Azure, Azure has what we call the site recovery, which is under the recovery service vault. So this is what it looks like, the recovery service vault. So here now, depending on what you want to do, either a backup or a site recovery, you're going to come here to site recovery. Then it asks you to do, okay, prepare your infrastructure. You're going to fill in all these details from what you already have on your environment. At this point, what I have is, okay, I have an on-prem. So what I did was to create an infrastructure on Azure to mimic my on-prem environment. Sorry, hold on. Let me. Okay. Okay, so yes, I created an on-prem environment to mimic a typical on-prem. Then I'm able to log in to that on-prem environment, which is an Hyper-V. So this is the Hyper-V. Yes. So I have another server running inside that particular environment, which is called the on-prem virtual machine, on-prem VM. So what I did now was to run through each of this process to try and fail over that particular environment onto my Azure. So going through the deployment process, I'm going to go through that. I did all these, but before that, I already installed the agent on this on-prem environment, which is my host here. That is the Hyper-V host. So from the Hyper-V host now, immediately I install the agent, I'm able to pull this particular virtual machine running on that particular Hyper-V host. Let me get back to it. So now when I did my site recovery, at the moment, I currently have, because I've done a couple of test failovers and I've run into some errors. Now I have a warning here. But what I'm able to do here is, this is the infrastructure here that it was. So it's saying one Hyper-V environment I've failed over onto Azure, which is my Azure Site Recovery, and I have my storage account. So if I click on this, you could see. So this is what I was talking about when I was saying that you should continually do a test failover to ensure that, in the case where your main environment goes down, what happens? At the moment now I can see, so I'll need to troubleshoot this after on, but I'm able to view my on-prem environment, which is this here, which has been replicated, so I can see all the errors that I'm currently encountering. So, but if I have my on-prem environment failed over successfully and it is healthy, I could do a test failover here. So when I'm doing the test failover, it means that I'm going to have a VM that is going to create the exact replica of my on-prem environment on Azure. So what that means is this: if I check on my IR secondary site, so if you look at these environments now, at the moment we don't have any tests VM here. So I have a VM called SQL. So but when these tests, so select, so starting the test failover. So if you look here now, at the moment, I want us to be able to point out that it's going to fail over that particular resource onto Azure here. Okay, so while that is ongoing, I also want to quickly show us a web application. Okay, so here I have a web application on Azure that is being set up. So if you look at this web application here, it's just a very, very basic application. Okay, so yeah, the application is currently running, and if I click here, you'd see, okay, so this is a very, very basic demo, basic page for disaster recovery. This one web application. Then I also have, if you look at this application here, it's currently hosted on East US. Then I have the failover of the same application here also. So I set up two web applications to run the same application, same. But what the end user is going to see now, because they are individual applications, they have their various resources running on them. But the end user is going to be seeing the front door. That is where I set up the Azure front door, which is going to load balance traffic. So going back to this, so I have these particular two applications running. So I now have a front door from Azure that's going to load balance traffic from both of them. So the user is going to be hitting the Azure front door. So if I click on this now, you can see that the Azure front door is also load balancing traffic to the endpoint. So what this means is this: if I shut down any of these applications now, so for instance, I come here and stop this application, my Azure front door would still load balance traffic onto the other application that is currently on. So if I, at this point now, this application is currently down. As you can see, this application is showing error 403 because the application is stopped, but the user is going to be seeing this page because there's also an instance of the application currently running available. Any questions so far? Hello?
No questions from our side. We're following you.
Okay, so that is the simple demo for a web application. So typically, Azure has all these services that can enable you to have resiliency for your system and for your application, where you have a load balancer at the front where the users are currently eating, and from the back end, any other thing could be happening. One system could be down and the other system is up. Your user would not have a downtime, and you can always load balance traffic from any of the resources, from any of the endpoints. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be two. Depending on how critical your application is, you could have as many endpoints as possible that is being load balanced from an Azure front door. Okay, so back to the on-prem, let me see, starting, okay, failover completed. Now, if I refresh, if you look at this end now, if I refresh, I should see an on-prem test VM now has now been provisioned for me. So what it has done is to fail over my on-prem environment onto Azure immediately with just a click of a button. So if I do a cleanup now, which is going to take time, and if you want to access this, since it doesn't have a public IP address system, you could set up a Bastion host to connect to it and all. The Bastion takes a bit of time, so I'm not going to run that in this particular demo. So if you want to run the application, you could ensure that your application has been successfully failed over onto Azure. So from my on-site now, I could now try to clean up the test failover. So if I clean up the test failover now, Okay. So cleanup is pending. So when I clean up the test failover, it's going to delete this particular instance that is being created for the infrastructure. So that is just a brief overview and demo. So for customers that want a bit more technical insights and technical hands-on demo, we could always organize that and speak to them as regards their critical application. So I think I've exceeded, the session is supposed to just take about 30 minutes, but I've exceeded that time. So I would like to thank us, and if you have any questions or you still need to discuss more about this, you could always reach us, or you send your messages on the chat, then we'll reach out to you and probably have more technical sessions for you. Any questions so far? So if I could just address that, and we end for today.
Hi, today. Thank you so much for your insight on the workshop. Very good presentation. I have learned quite a bit from it as well, and we hope to join any other sessions that you'll be giving in the future. Thank you.
You're welcome.